This is a debate that has been going on not just for years, but for decades. And I think much of the issue is terrorism is a word in popular usage. Different people mean different things by it. Academics don't own it. So there's always going to be debates. The key debates are often around whether we should use terrorism only for those violent actors who oppose the state, or whether we should also use it to refer to some of the terrible actions that some governments use. I think if we're going to use it, and it's hard to get away from it, I would say that it often is a term that seems to have an implication of indirect violence. In other words, somebody attacks some group to send a message beyond that group to the government or wider society. So that is kind of usually the popular way in which it is used. And that, I think, to some extent does mark it out from other forms of political violence that might be riots or things like that. So, you know, it's not a perfect term, but I would say it's that emphasis on communication that probably makes it different from other forms of political violence. Of course, you can argue over what is terrorism, but taking the question fairly simply, no. Actually, the 1970s in Western Europe were worse in terms of numbers of people killed. They were often different types of attack. There was lots of much smaller scale attacks. So from that point of view, no, this isn't the worst age of terrorism we've seen. And I think it's also important to remember that taking a very wide and long view, this isn't the worst that can happen. There are many other types of political violence, coups, wars. You know, the last few decades in Western Europe, despite austerity, have been good times, and that's why we notice terrorism more. So no, we shouldn't overreact. No, I don't think it can. I think we have to make a distinction between the horrible things that happen to a small group of people who are affected, and the people who love them and are related to them, and societies as a whole. Societies as a whole are resilient. You know, the latest horrors in London killed 8 people and are, you know, clearly devastating for those who are connected to them. But London will survive. In World War II, 56,000 Londoners were killed. The city survived, and it will do. So I think we need to be kind of slightly careful about thinking of this as a sort of existential threat that can bring down whole societies, because that actually helps ISIS. It actually helps those who want to believe that. The real dangers, I think, come from government overreaction, that if we give up our values of democratic restraint, freedom of speech, human rights protection, then that's where the damage will come, but it will come from potential government overreaction, not from the terrorists themselves. With difficulty. It's not an easy phenomenon to understand. Really, there are 2 schools of thought. Those that say, well, for those planning suicide terrorism, it makes sense. It's very cheap, it's very effective. You have a targeted bomb that you can put exactly where you want. And those, of course, you try and look more at the bomber and say, how could anyone do this? I mean, of course, no answer I can give you is going to help anyone who's been directly affected. It doesn't help explain it in emotional terms. But I think one can begin to see reasons why some individuals perhaps become so desperate or feeling alienated that somehow suicide seems to be a way out or something heroic. I sometimes think when we look at suicide bombing, we look too much at the bombing. We don't look enough at suicide. You know, we know, for instance, that that often one can find places where there is a cluster of teenage suicides, where somehow, for some vulnerable young teenagers, suicide becomes something kind of attractive and fashionable. And I think, in a sense, we're seeing some sort of political version of that or something like it. It's hard to give a simple explanation, it's not a simple phenomenon, but we shouldn't give up trying to understand it. By training, I'm a historian, and if historians don't want to talk about something, they say, that is not my period. If you ask a historian about the future, they say, that is definitely not my period, I don't do the future. I think what we can say, though, is terrorism has, unfortunately, been part of the development of modern Western societies. If we take this town, November the 7th, 1893, big bomb in the Barcelona Opera House. So even back then, it was an emerging phenomenon. I think that it will evolve and there will be different tactics, and terrorist campaigns fade away. They come, they go, and they fade. So I think what we're living through at the moment will also fade. But unfortunately, there may well be something to replace it that is hard to predict. Right now there's a lot of concerns around cyber terrorism, understandably. It is possible to imagine other causes, environmental terrorism and so on and so forth. So it's not all about kind of Islamist extremism. I think what we've got at the moment will probably remain for a time because the conditions are there for it to do so, but we shouldn't think that it will bring down Western societies unless we overreact. So my slightly British don't panic kind of reaction is I don't think terrorism as such will disappear, but these campaigns will fade, and we have to kind of be patient.